Leo Varadkar, the liar, broke his promises to the women dying of cervical cancer who have been forced to fight in the courts despite his promise that they wouldn't have to do that and the state would represent them. Imagine the stress these women are going through and all the time knowing that Leo Varadkar had let them down. The Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, told the women involved in the cervical screening scandal that the state would represent them in court. But then he went back on his promise, turned around and said, "Oh well, I should have been clearer." So Leo is a liar, and he stuttered his way through an interview on RTE News when asked were we still using the same labs in the USA. This government is so addicted to outsourcing and privatisation that they can't even break from these private companies after these private companies have caused the death of women. So why the hell is Leo and his party Fine Gael rising in the polls? Have people gone mad? The establishment parties are starting to stabilise. In the 80s they used to get about 80% of the vote, and that dropped after the crash to about 50%. But they've crept their way back up to just over 60% of the vote now. How are they doing it? I mean, let's remind ourselves what happened. In 2007, 2008, the economy collapsed because the right-wing parties had fed a housing bubble. Fianna Fáil bailed out the banks with votes from all the establishment parties, including Labour, costing the Irish people billions. They then set up NAMA to bail out the developers to make sure their mates were A-OK when the crash came, even though they were the very people who had caused it. Those who created the crash were able to use their connections to state power through the establishment parties to make us pay for what they did. And there was opposition to this. In 2009, there were marches of 120,000 people, big massive union marches against austerity. But the problem was they were led by people like Jack O'Connor. What did he say from the stage when the tens of thousands were gathered in front of them? Vote Labour. And so working class people who for decades had voted Fianna Fáil switched over to voting Labour. Guess what? Labour gets in and then kicks people in the face. That led to a year or two of demoralisation. But in 2014, the water movement saw working class communities regain their confidence as community protests saw people prevent the installation of water meters. But it was with the Right to Water campaign that tens of thousands of working class people came out onto the streets. The confidence that the Right to Water movement gave people saw a huge rise in the polls for the left. As people gain in confidence, they can imagine that alternatives are possible. Fine Gael survived the water charges movement by backing down. And really, that was a valuable lesson for them. Because when Enda Kenny stepped down and Leo Varadkar stepped in, he adopted the exact same policy. Don't fully oppose social movements. Bend, give a little bit of leeway. Try and co-opt the movement. Talk with radical rhetoric while you still represent the same old inequality. Spend millions on spin, explaining to people how liberal you are when your liberalism is only skin deep. What kind of liberalism is it that gives women the right to choose only after tens of thousands have marched? And then says to women, you can have your choice within a health service we've destroyed with neoliberal policies? Or what kind of liberalism is it that says we're for women's rights and then allows women with cervical cancer to have to fight through the courts for compensation for them and their families? So when the pollsters say people are supporting Fine Gael and voters are returning to Fine Gael, which people? That's what we have to ask. Is it the people in Neilstown or the people of Foxrock? Because those two groups of people belong to very different classes. And so the very wealthy people, the 30% of people at the top of Irish society, will always vote for Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. Then you've got the middle class, and I'm not talking about white collar workers, you're talking about HR managers, lawyers, upper professionals. Those kind of people, they turned away from Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael in disgust. Not austerity, because some of those people are okay with sticking water charges on people like us. But they were disgusted with the corruption surrounding the bank bailout and the corruption surrounding NAMA. So they turned away in disgust. And then, once the economy started to recover for them, they went back to the establishment parties. No surprise there. And then you've got working class people, white collar workers and blue collar workers. The working class vote in Ireland has predominantly shifted to the left over the last few years, or parties that people perceive as being on the left. So in a class society, it's not as simple as saying the people are voting for Fine Gael. Some people support Fine Gael and lots of people don't. In fact, in working class areas, like where I come from, there's a lot of people who don't bother voting. When I was younger, I didn't bother voting. Not because I was stupid or ignorant, but because I thought the politicians were all corrupt and there was no point voting for any of them. I mean, there's the beginning of a certain wisdom there about the nature of the system. But as I got older, I've learned to vote tactically. I vote for people who have principled left-wing politics, who stand up for the working class, who only take the average wage, who truly represent working class people, who roll their sleeves up and get the work done. People like Breed Smith or Gene O'Kenny. People who use the Dáil as a megaphone to express the interests of the working class.